From the campus of Eastside Church in suburban Atlanta, it is a delight to be able to talk to a familiar face to those of you that watch 100 Huntley Street. And of course, I'm talking about Shaunti Feldhahn. And I have here one of her many books. This wonderful author has had millions of her books sold and read. This one is called For Women Only. And Shaunti, welcome back to 100 Huntley Street.
It's great to be back with you.
This time we've come to Atlanta where you live.
I like it. I don't have to get on an airplane. That's awesome.
And for people like you, that is a treat. Well, you have a book for men only, for women only.
Yeah.
Let me ask before we get into the For Women Only book in this segment, how did you did your graduate work at Harvard?
Yeah.
How did you get into this field of male, female relationships and all the dynamics of that?
I know people are like, is this what they're teaching at Harvard now? Yeah, no. It's actually really interesting. It's one of those examples of where God has a plan that you could never have predicted, right? So I did my graduate work at Harvard as an analyst, got an analytical graduate degree, worked on Wall Street, didn't know it, but I was building this foundation of kind of digging out the hidden things that matter, and ended up using that in a completely different way from the finance arena into relationships.
Right.
This whole thing started actually when we moved, Jeff and I moved down from Manhattan down to Atlanta, and I was actually doing research for a novel. I had this opportunity to write a novel, and one of my main characters in this novel was a guy.
Okay.
And I didn't know what a guy would be thinking, but I had to put thoughts in his head because he was my main character. And so this whole thing started because I would talk to Jeff, or if I'd be out to dinner, you know, like with a guy like you, and Jeff and I would be out with another couple, and I'd go to the other guy and I'd say, okay, so here's this scene in the book. What would you be thinking if this was you? And as these men started telling me, half the time I'm like, seriously? I was so shocked by some of the things these men were telling me.
Yeah.
And I started to realize, okay, this is when the analyst hat goes, you know, the analyst hat goes
Right.
on. And I started to realize eventually as I did more of these, what I was hearing, it wasn't just that it was surprising. I started to realize what I was hearing was really foundational. This wasn't stuff that these men described thinking like, you know, once every 3 months. The stuff they were talking about was stuff that they thought or felt every day. Mm-hmm. And I've been married for, I guess, 8 years at that point. I'm like, why haven't I heard this before? And so that's really where it ended up being that I started it as a research study. And God made this amazing way to study and survey men and then women and then teenagers all over the country, these big nationally representative surveys, to be able to dig out what is common to men that women don't get.
So I'm going to ask you a feel question. How does it feel to be a woman who knows so much about men? I mean, that's kind of that's a unique position.
It is
for women to focus on a man.
I will be really honest. It has been the most amazing thing personally and professionally. Personally, it took a while, but I started to realize when I would say something and Jeff, my husband, would respond in a way that I was like, what? You know, it used to be I'd be like, what, why'd that make you so mad? And then suddenly I'm like, oh, I know exactly why that made him upset. And you start rethinking, okay, how do you do things differently? And our marriage is so much better. And then he started learning because we started being able to talk about stuff that most of us don't know about each other.
Is it a genetic thing? We know men and women are different. Are there environmental reasons? Are there how we're raised? Does it come from social expectations? Where does this difference? Does it go back to our creation by God? What's the story with that?
I think it's all of the above. It's actually, for me, the foundation seems to be how God created men and women different. Because literally you look at it's called a functional MRI scan. If you look at a functional MRI scan of the brain, sorry, I've had to learn way more about neuroscience than any layperson ever should know. But when you look at the brain scans, you actually see the male and the female brains are structured differently. There is a physical structural difference, and it leads to processing things differently, and that leads to all sorts of misunderstandings. And then I think also, if you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, if we can sort of be super spiritual for a minute, and look at some of the different insecurities and stuff that God said would come out of the fall,
Yeah.
there are different sets of fears and insecurities that men and women have. And that leads to some different sort of twitchiness in some areas and concerns, and it leads to different needs. And so then I'd see there's a lot that I'm sure is socialized, so there's a big mix, but I always focus a lot on the brain wiring. So
Other than being extremely nervous any time that I interview because you've already got me figured out, what do we need to know about men? What is it about guys?
okay, so the top thing I always tell women is, and it leads to so many other things, is to realize that you guys are not as confident as you look. Wow. See, we think you think you're all that, right? We think that you think I got it figured out.
I have no chance. I have no chance in this interview whatsoever. Please continue, Shaunti Feldhahn. Yes, please.
Listen, it's funny because I make a lot of men twitchy because they're like, okay, you realize.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And it's funny though, when a woman realizes that, here's the problem. When we think that you really are as confident as you look, because you guys really do look really confident, we respond to the outer man, not the inner one. And I started to realize as I started to do these interviews that you guys, that there's so much more vulnerability, that men described it like this feeling of, I want to tackle a challenge, I want to be great, I want to be a great pastor or a great dad or a great husband or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But I'm really not sure I know what I'm doing, and I hope nobody finds out. And there's this, like, the guys called it the imposter complex.
Yeah, you do fear that someday someone's going to discover that you're not as good as other people think you are.
And let me tell you, what women don't realize is that leads to men carrying around this kind of underground self-doubt and this vulnerability that we don't even know is there. And here's what it is for us as in a relationship. So if you've got a husband and wife, and the husband is carrying around this vulnerability she doesn't know is there, it's like a raw nerve in him, in his heart. And she can hit the nerve without having any idea that that's what she's doing and send the message that I think you're inadequate. And she wouldn't intend to, but like here's an example. So I had one guy who said, anytime a woman starts a sentence with, why did you? Why did you do that? Why did you make that choice? He's like, in the man's mind, just add a comma, you dodo on the end of that. Why did you do that?
And that's a very polite thing to call him.
That is probably the nice Christian version of that.
That's right.
And I realized as I started to ask this man, this was very early on in the research, and I said, but that's not what we're saying. I'm not saying you dodo, I'm just asking for information, And he said, look, that's what we're hearing. In other words, the raw nerve is being hit. And I said, help me understand, what do I say instead? If I need to ask my husband why, I need to ask him why, right? I mean, I need to be able to figure out what on earth. And he said, look, how much difference would it make if you said, I know, honey, you must have had a reason for this thing that, I'm like, what was he thinking? If you approach it like, you must have had a reason, you're not an idiot. You must have had a reason for this. I can't figure it out. Just help me understand. It's the same question, but it's asked in a way that doesn't hit the nerve for a guy.
It's very good. Are there other ways that women can respond to men's self-doubt?
Oh, yeah. Well, let's talk about the good way for a minute.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about the good way, because
I'm getting killed here.
There's all sorts of ways that we can hit the nerve, right? That's just one example. Uh-huh. But what it leads to is it's also a wonderful, brilliant, amazing, beautiful opportunity for you as a wife or a girlfriend to learn, okay, if that self-doubt is there, how can I build him up instead of accidentally tearing him down? And one of the ways that we found is bigger than anything else, we actually statistically found this on the last survey, is if you say thank you. Believe it or not, for a man, hearing thank you is like a woman hearing I love you. It's the statistical equivalent.
Thank you is huge. You're right.
And it's basically, and the women are listening are going, what? And I'll tell them why. And because let me tell you, this took me a while to realize. The reason is he's got all that self-doubt, and it basically translates into, do I measure up? Am I any good as a husband or a father? And so when you say little things like, thanks for always bringing me coffee in the morning, He's thinking, I did a good job. I'm good as a husband.
It's like a parade.
It's like a parade, and it's just those two words, and you had no idea that it mattered so much. Can I use that comment? It's like a parade. That's awesome.
Yeah, because my wife actually says that to me.
Oh, that's great.
You know, that sometimes I need a parade, and that's when she'll say stuff. I'm going to quote you here. We've heard it said that men are visual, and many women listening to this have had to confront a concern about whether their man is looking sideways at another woman or looking at porn.
Yeah.
Tell us about your studies of this and what's going on inside them that's kind of causing those things to take place.
So you're tackling two sensitive subjects in this discussion.
We can go an extra minute or two because
it's actually it's a big deal. So here's what I've realized in the short version. I actually just released a book called Through a Man's Eyes that took that chapter of For Women Only and blew it up book size.
And we had you on the show before with that.
Yes, you did.
You and I talked about that.
Yeah, and let me tell you, here's what we women don't really realize. We have no idea that the male brain is structured in a way that the female brain isn't. And one of the structural differences, one of the things that happens is that in this culture, the male brain is constantly being sexually stimulated.
Yes.
Because of there's a processing difference, there's a way that men see these images that women don't see them. And so with the female, wife, the girlfriend, we have never experienced life the same way you do. Because it just doesn't hit us in the same way. And so there's this trigger that's constantly happening, this biological, involuntary piece of this. Now, there's a choice piece too, but the first thing that happens when he sees those images is actually biological and involuntary. It's a stimulation whether he wants it to be or not. And many men have said, I wish I could turn it off, unless I'm alone with my wife. Then I want that part on.
Sure.
But out there in public, I wish I could turn it off. And the problem is because that's being stimulated constantly, basically the culture is filled with things that were only supposed to be seen in private, but they're seen in public. And so there's a minefield, not just for our men, but for our boys, for our sons. And so we as women have to know how to address it in a way that's healthy and leads to actually bringing some life and light and help to men and not condemnation.
And not false guilt and shame, right?
Correct. Many men actually have told me that when they read that chapter in For Women Only, or when they read Through a Man's Eyes, that it was this huge relief to learn that just because they had that biological stimulation, it didn't mean that they were like a pervert. Like men are... One man told me, he's like, guys don't talk about this stuff all the time. He's like, we don't sit around at Starbucks saying, you got images? Yeah, I got images, And so it's really helpful also for men to know, I am a normal visual man living with a normal visual brain in an abnormal culture. And for women to know, okay, how do I talk to him about it? And the key is to be really calm and to approach it like, I want to understand you for real. Because men know, they say, honestly, whether they're handling it really well or they've started to handle something poorly, most men want to be able to talk about this with their wife, but they don't want to hurt her feelings or they think it's not safe.
In my years of pastoring, I can just say there's some men who just think their wives would not even accept it. We're going to have to run, and we're going to talk some more about your other book, for Men Only. But For Women Only, over 2 million of these books sold in multiple languages around the world. Shaunti brings passion and excitement as well as scientific data to her research, all through a biblical worldview. You see it there on the screen. It's called For Women Only. It's available in our e-store, and we hope that you will get it. Shaunti, it's good to see you.
Thanks, John.
Come back and see us again.